and he worked in, I believe, every position. We're really excited to hear about Soteria House. It has kind of a complicated history, but a really fascinating history. And definitely, as people have said, there's such a need for alternatives. The right kind of help is just not there for so many people. And Soteria House was a really groundbreaking concept. Lauren Mosier was the one who, a psychiatrist who came up with the concept. Sadly, he is no longer with us. But we're really excited, and being a trailblazer is kind of runs in the family. Voyce Hendrix he's the cousin of Jimi Hendrix, the famous guitar player. So we're really excited to have Voyce here today to talk about his experience.
Oh, am I on?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Soteria. You have to go back to 1971 when it actually opened its doors. And to understand Soteria and to understand not only Soteria, but you have to understand the time in which it existed and the conditions and the politics of Soteria. And that brings up Lauren Mosier. Lauren Mosier was the person who wrote the proposal at NIMH, and actually where he got the idea was spending a year in London in Kingsley Hall with R.D. Lang and that group, the Philadelphia Association. The position of that he was in at NIMH was set up for him a year before he actually got in the position. So when he came back to the United States, he wanted to, in a way, replicate Kingsley Hall, but realized that would be an impossible thing, because if he actually just replicated as it was, it would never work, and it would never get funded, and it would never happen. And also at the same time, Lauren was part of a study that was going on in San Jose, California, at the state hospital, Agnew State Hospital. A place was called, the study was called the Rappaport-Silverman study, and it was at Ward 11 at the hospital. And actually, Soteria comes out of between Kingsley Hall and the research project at the hospital. The combining those two things where Soteria originally comes out of. Originally, Lauren expected to do Soteria at the hospital, but it became very clear that wouldn't make any sense at all, because the whole point is to normalize the process, and that it being in the hospital in that institution would immediately make the whole process institutionalized. So the next step was where to do that, and so San Jose was the most logical place for it to happen. It was close to the hospital. It had, at the time, Santa Clara Mental Health System, which is the county with San Jose is in, was supposed to be one of the top counties in the nation at the time, the mental health system. So the study would be comparing Soteria to not a terrible system to one of the best systems in the country at the time. So that would make it even much more legitimate, the study itself. So when Lauren got back to Washington and that in his new position, he immediately contacted Ward 11 at Agnew State Hospital and started to, after he had wrote at this point, had wrote the grant and it was accepted and everything. Originally, when he wrote the grant, he expected to have Soterias all over the country and a huge study. And they informed Lauren that they didn't think he could pull off one. So the default was the Soteria in San Jose. And so Lauren hired, the first person Lauren hired was Alma Min, who was the social worker on that unit, the Ward 11 unit. And actually, as I recall, only one of the 6 first staff had some involvement on that unit. Even myself, I didn't work for the unit. I worked for the hospital itself, but I worked in the admission suite and was responsible for delivering the clients' patients to that unit, that study. So that was my involvement. And when they had crisis over there, I would have to go over and help deal with conflict and stuff. So my input was just back, just for actually it was quite a bit, but it was not really detailed, not clinically. It was much more just delivering their new clients. The first 6 staff we had, like I said, all 5 of them had in contact with that unit. The sixth one was just someone who was a friend of one of those 5 people. So, in somewhere, all 6 of the first staff were kind of connected. To understand Soteria, you have to realize Soteria happened in 1971. There was no AMI, there was no consumer groups, there was none of that stuff. The Mental Health Act, the National Mental Health Act, had just been acted only a few years before that. And these groups really are products that comes out of the Mental Health Act. I think it was like somewhere right after 1965, I think, when it was enacted. But it didn't really get implemented until something that early 70s to probably be somewhere from 1970 to 1973 to actually get implemented. And the product out of that process that happened in the 3 years were instrumentally in setting up the process where families became involved, and the family organizations became the first family organization. And one of the first family organizations was actually in San Jose as PAMI, that's the name of it. Parents of mentally ill, the parents of the mentally ill or something. I'm not sure what that acronym stands for. It was the first family group, and it came out of the Mental Health Act set up a process where they had an advisory group to the mental health system in each county. And that advisory group was dominated by family members, actually. And they eventually broke off from that process and created the first family group. That's how it happened. I was a part of that first family group. As part of Soteria, they wanted professional people to be involved, and I was one of the probably only about three professional people involved in that process, and I was one of those 3. So, and Soteria, at that time, Soteria was really popular in that group. So it wasn't a pariah or anything. They saw it as a part of the group. So the next thing probably be to understand about Soteria. Soteria was a mental health program, but it was predominantly a research program. Actually, if you think about Soteria, the most important part about Soteria, it is the clinical setting, but the fact that we did this and it was studied and it goes out to the world, that gives us its power, and that's why it still exists today, because all of the journals, major journals, there's I think like 200 journal articles and I don't know how many books that have been written about Soteria, and that one of the things that keeps it alive. Pharma and the other groups can't make it go away because it's out there in a way that they can't cover it up. So and you have to acknowledge the person most important. That would be Lauren Mosier. The second most important person, especially at the beginning of the project, is Alma Min. She was the house director, the original house director. And I can't say too much about how smart this woman was at the time. She is one of the most, I think you had to give the most important role for Soteria to actually evolve the way it evolved. I say Soteria wasn't a revolution, it was a rapid evolution. Because if you understand how it evolved at the beginning, the first people you have to think about Soteria. When we had 3 weeks to get ready for before our first client was admitted to Soteria, and we had training from I from most of the top professional people in the area. One of the top Jungian, uh, I'm blocking his name now. John Perry, who was president of the National Jungian Society, was one of our main trainers. We spent uh, about 3 or 4 days at Esalen Institute with all their powerful therapists giving us all kinds of advice. We spent a lot of that research project, Ward 11, which I probably should talk a little bit about because to get to understand because it affects the theory very profoundly. Um, the, the Ward 11 has been one of the main contributors to the model we call the Soteria model. If you think of what happened actually in the house itself, it comes from that that unit, and it was called. They had a process called the vigil, and what the vigil was that um, two staff members would take a client who's going through crisis, and he would take them. They would take them in a room and close the door.
Hold on.
We can't hear you now.
Hold on. Something happened. I'm sorry. I think you're muted. Can you try to unmute yourself? Oh, sorry. How did that happen?
Mute.
There you
There.
are.
Okay. I don't know why.
No, that was me. I'm so sorry. I was
Oh, okay.
some other noise I was trying to get rid of. No, it happened again. Damn it. Can everybody else, while Voice is unmuting, can everybody else mute yourselves? There was some background noise.
Yeah, because the mute other thing comes up too, the saying like somebody else is on. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, back to Ward 11. Ward 11 was a double-blind medication study. So the issue of medications became very important at this point. And you have to realize in this started at like 68 and 69, the ideal of Soteria. So you have to realize medication and pharma is not the same as medications and pharma now. In fact, the ideal of there were certain diagnoses that was seen as effective with certain certain type of behaviors, and certain other diagnoses were seen as medications not being effective. So the original design of Soteria was set up to the folks who would benefit from medication would get medication at admissions and continue while they're at Soteria, and the other clients who didn't have see medications as a positive thing would not get medication. That was the original design. Of course, it never happened. One of the problems is the staff. Even though the staff not really anti-medication, but for some reason the 3-week training, and the people we interacted with, and some of the sort of latent, I think, feelings among the staff that medication was problematic. And it was not so much the medicine problematic as the way we use medication. And so there was clearly an anti-medication sentiment within that staff when the first resident moved into Soteria. And as a consequence, no one got medicine. Out of the first 3 clients that were admitted, no one actually got medicated at all. Where the change happens, I'll go back and finish the Ward 11. It was a double-blind study where half the people admitted got medication, the other half got placebo. So you got what you have is a really clear, and the clinical staff had no idea who was getting medication. And it was very clear to me that the clinical staff knew who was getting medication and who wasn't getting medication. That this was the kind of what you got when you talked to the staff. Turned out at the end that they were totally wrong. The best outcomes with the people who didn't get medication, and the worst outcome were people who got medication for some reason. So this is the climate that Soteria is coming out of. So as Soteria gets set up, like I said, there is the research part of Soteria where I get a lot of questions about the quality of research and how the research might have been bad. That's why you got. I think at the time, the technology, the research, Lauren Moser had access to pretty much all at NIMH and everything that was available in terms of research. He had the best researchers and everything. So the design of the research itself, I think, was great given the time. It was a part what they call a tripartite study. One of the important things to know, the argument was, it was really signed up as first as a bipartite. In other words, he had an experimental group, which was the Soteria House, and a control group, which was the county hospital. So a person would come into the county hospital and they would diagnose, and the random selection. They either go, you'd agree, the client would agree to be in the study. Then you would come up Soteria, or you'd come up to control, and you would go. Soteria had no control of who came and have it. So they wanted it to be a very clear process that they could follow. And originally they're going to follow people for 2 years, but it wound up following people for 5 years. So it became very clear that Soteria could only have 6 residents in any one time because of the laws. If you had more than 6 residents in your facility, it required you have sprinklers in your roof. It became too expensive to run a facility like that. So by definition, we had to be only 6 residents. And so the argument would be that people would come up for Soteria and we'd be full, and we would, they would not be able to go sit there and stay in the hospital. Then we would find some way to find the best, be closed when the horrible people came in, and be open when the easy people came in. But so they decide, well, the tripartite, we would have to set up and make a 3rd category. And that 3rd category were people who came up for Soteria, but Soteria was filled. They would go into a 3rd group and followed separately from the control group, but they would go through the same procedures, the same system as the control group, but they would be followed separately. The reason for that is to find out if these 2 groups are different. If somehow we were selecting the worst, and they would look different. It turned out that they were identical. So Soteria didn't select out different groups. Okay, Soteria, like I said, over the first 3 weeks, we do it through this not horrible training, but really extensive training of doing all kinds of things with all kinds of people. The first resident came in, we were totally shocked because we had no idea this person was going to show up at the door. There was a psychologist who was associated with the project who interviewed the client at the hospital and brought her over one day and only told us about a half hour before we got there. She got there, and we were totally unprepared. The other thing you had to understand about Soteria too, that at the first 6 months of Soteria, 4 of the staff actually lived in Soteria. So it's complicated in one way, but it's in another way it's interesting because later on it seemed to affect the outcome in some ways. But as I say, the first resume we got was ideal for Soteria. She was one of the most, and I've worked in this field for years before Soteria, and I worked in the system where you, with the most, in the admission suite, the highest security ward at the state hospital. So I had a lot of experience with very severe people, and this client was extremely severe. She was, but the good thing about it, she was fun. She was, and if you have to realize, she got 6 Soteria staff, 4 of them living in the facility itself. We have probably about 5 or 6 volunteers who are hanging out, and suddenly this young woman walks in the door, and you have to understand there was no staffing. We hadn't dealt with the issue of staffing. So it's just suddenly she was, I feel sorry for her even thinking about it now. She was accosted about 12 people suddenly all wanting to spend time with her. It just, that first day, and she loved it. It was I guess it was the most joyous first 2 days. It set the theme for Soteria, and as I say, the issue of the visual, the concept we were thinking, was the only thing we had as a clinical way of interacting with people, was taking someone in a small room and being with her. And obviously that's not going to work. 12 people in the room is not going to work. So the visual, actually it was like the visual that we were all concentrated, but it was the whole house that became the visual room. So if you think about Soteria, the model itself, people being with each other in interacting, sort of as a kind of large family in some ways. But the first, like I say, the first actually 3 months, we didn't establish schedules, and what happened is everybody was there all the time. People after the 3rd month, people started to burn out, and so we had to do something. And we tried, for the first year, we tried all kinds of different things, and none of it stuck. And which leads to the what I call the crisis. And it's kind of something that happens. If you think about the Soteria staff and the Soteria community at the time, it was sort of chaotic and undefined, and that's why I talk about rapid evolution rather than revolution, because what happened, Soteria evolved very rapidly into something. It went through all kinds of, if you think about mutation in terms of evolution, that kind of thing happened, but it happened in a very rapid way. And like I said, after the first year, we had 3 females and 4 men. Yeah. And we needed another female. It was very clear we needed another female, and then they agreed to hire us another female, which was the point of crisis. The process set up with 2 very qualified female, but they were radically different. And the politics of the house at the time, the first staff that was hired was a male at the Ward 11, and he was kind of, he was very intelligent, but he's kind of a macho type male. And the two females were very feminist and very, but it's complicated because I think without knowing, the male person and one of the females must have had a relationship back at the hospital, but it was never talked about. So when the two females, when the two females became up to be hired, there was a split. The male wanted this one female, the two females wanted the other female. And what was a subtle thing, the male, because he was hired first, had this kind of unspoken thing of him being the senior staff. And because the thing I hadn't talked about, Mama had to go back to the Mental Research Institute was the umbrella organization. She had to go back, and she was very little time at Soteria because they had to refund the research project. So she was spending all her time not at the house. So there was this leadership vacuum in the house. So him feeling that he was in control, although he really wasn't in control, but this kind of in his own head. And so he did this kind of a sneaky thing. He went out and started asking everybody in the house who they wanted to hire, and he asked the selected residents, and the two residents he didn't ask were the residents that were interested in having the person he didn't want. And so what happened? He calls Alma, and Alma hires the person he wanted to hire. And from that point on, it was actually a trifurcation of the staff. That the two females never talked to him anymore during the time. It actually was that dramatic. That one male staff, there were myself and another male staff who refused to join either one of the groups, because we saw it as important for us to be able to be there for 7 days a week if we needed to. And because when the group split off, they split off the week. The female had the weekdays, and the male and his brother and a few others had the weekend. So it really actually split Soteria in two pieces. I know this sounds chaotic and weird, but it is important in some strange way, because, and so like I said, the other two of us, we could go both. We filled in on both sides, and we made it clear that we're not going to join the group. So that allowed the system to work. It actually worked. And my feeling during this period, this lasted actually about 8 months. My feeling that the clients, our clients, were being harmed, and everybody, the other side one side thought that they were being harmed because of this group, and the other side thought it was being harmed because of the other group. But it's interesting, and Lauren Mosher and I talked a lot about this. If you look at the studies, the most effective, best outcome for Soteria is during this period, which makes no sense. It actually, it was fairly dramatic. The dramatic difference from that first year and a half, the outcome is really dramatically different than the control group in some ways. And I don't understand. But it's interesting to realize actually a lot of consumers chose sides, were involved in this. And I see that some kind of dynamics where even when you have conflicts, within that conflicts, if the consumers have access and involved in that process, it's not necessarily harmful in some ways that you think of. But it was not something that could last. There's no way we would have survived much longer. But what happened Lauren and Alma, when they went to conferences, they always took one of the staff. And at that end point, that the first staff went to a conference in Texas with Alma and Lauren. And when he went for that, I think for like 3 or 4 days, and while Alma and were in Texas, that the other one side called Alma, said if he comes back, we're all leaving. And Alma fired the first staff. That ended the conflict. And so after that, we still went through a few other processes. Myself and one of the females were designated senior staff. And I started to function in that role as actually being the main staff, because I knew everybody at the county hospital, because I work in the state hospital. So when people got admitted, I was the person when pick people up, and I became more dominant in that way. And about 6 months after that, we got the new money to fund a new project in another county to see a show that Soteria was not a fluke, that they could be reproduced. And so we got that money. When we got that money, I got the role of the house director, and the other senior staff actually quit. So that whole group, after when I got director, had all left. So it left me as the director of the Soteria House. That's where I became director, and that was about 2 years into the study. So what is important about Soteria? So if you think about Soteria, you think about the philosophy. I have to make it clear: Soteria has no philosophy. There is no what's the right way, other than some broad concepts like being with versus doing to, and that, which, like I said, individual. What we did essentially create an environment where people could be who they are, and we lessen that structure where you have the stratification of staff, and that's where when we talked, we met as a group and decided that we needed a more permanent, stable staff structure. And that's when we came up with, we would have balance. We'd have one male and one female staff on at all times. And we split, and we had this, that way it was the balance. There was all the male female thing would be balanced. And so what that meant is that people worked 48-hour shifts, but you slept, you slept 8 hours for 2 nights. So it's like people accepted that 4 hour, above 40 hours is not good. In this case, they lock several of our staff at that time were grad students and stuff like that, and it gave them time to do school. It was perfect for them. The other reasoning behind it is that, and it became very clear, it's very different when you're with someone 48 hours versus being with someone for 8-hour shifts. For one, there's no way in 48 hours you can come to work all dressed up and be clean and be able to sustain that, put up with everything for 8 hours and go home and kick your dog and do all that kind of weird stuff. So if you're there for 48 hours, they're going to see you wake up in the morning, getting angry, doing your hair all messed up, and people are going to see you as a full human. And it makes a very big difference. So that once that happened, it really changed the dynamic of the school, of the setting, and it made it much more sustainable as a process in terms of people being able to get through the week and not have burnout. In fact, it did totally the opposite. Um, like I say, to understand how people came to Soteria I think it's an important thing to understand. Like I said, except for that first resident, I'll get mixed up with saying clients and resident, because technically we call people who live there residents. But for every resident that was admitted, other than that first person, was admitted by me. I was the one who went down to the hospital and did the process of getting meeting and going to the chart and driving them to Soteria. And that after the first 2 or 3 admissions, I became talking to staff, became very concerned about that transition, me dropping people off and how to best do that. And we came up with a model where I would actually usually spend a couple of hours at the hospital, first getting to know everything that's written about the person, and then spending the rest of the time, and sometimes an hour and a half, with the person at the hospital, not at Soteria, getting to know, making that connection between me and that person. It became very important because when I walked into the door with Soteria with this person came in with somebody, even though it's only in a couple hours, it is profoundly different. It's like, usually that person would never, for the first hour, I would be in their sight. And you could see it over time. And usually I always stayed at least 6 to 8 hours there before I would leave. And I would make sure that somebody else, other people there, were making that connections before I'd leave. And that turned out to be a really powerful way to enter a community. And the other thing that was common when you first bring someone in you just left in a setting that they were all the charts, this kind of bizarre behavior and all this stuff. Usually when they walk in the door, you almost saw no symptoms. It usually take 1 to 2, maybe 3 hours before the symptoms start to return. And then from then on, and you could see it had a lot to do with their familiarity and their comfort with the setting and the people in the setting before that stuff started coming out. And except for the first, like I said, our first resident, she came in, it was total chaos. And like I said, when she walked in, she was like she had lived there for her whole life, and she knew everybody there. And when I say bizarre, we spent half the time trying to keep her clothes on. She was running around doing all kinds of things, and we were doing all kinds of things to accommodate her and try to be appropriate and feel embarrassing about someone taking their clothes off and all that kind of stuff. It was the first, like I say, the first week with her was interesting. And the interesting thing about it, the second day we took her to the beach, and on the beach, she was no different than ever. She was the bizarre, but the beach is strange, and it turned out to be a really good thing. And it was another way of connecting to her in a broader context. Because if you think about Soteria, and this is important because this is what's different than Kingsley Hall versus Soteria, the program in England where Lauren came up with the idea. Kingsley Hall saw itself as Artie Lang told me personally, as an asylum, not in the negative way that asylum, you think of these hospitals in the movies, but asylum is a way, somewhere where I can be, the client can be, and be safe and be safe from the world. With Soteria, the whole concept of Soteria is keeping people in the world. It's not the whole bringing them to Soteria and not letting them be institutionalized. It's that the more you can keep them out in and the more the degree, the better. And that so in that sense, it was never designed as a place to live, because you could go to and average stay at Soteria was 3 months. You can come in and then you leave. And I'll have to talk about that later. Leaving, it took us, the first 2 clients took 5 months to get them to discharge. Not that they were ready in 3 months, but it took us 2 months to figure out how to get someone to leave. And the fact that first client, I think we found like 3 apartments for her to go, and the final act, we found an apartment, and what we decided to do is have a party. The apartment, and we all had a party at her apartment, and it was so much fun that it was and one of the female staff stayed the night with her, and that was the way we actually got the first resident to actually be discharged from Soteria. Of course, she came back for the first 2 weeks and ate at the house, but she still had Soteria, and that's a very common thing, especially in the early part, for people when they get discharged to come and sort of hang out, Soteria, eat, and sort of gradually move out. So if you think of like I say, Soteria was seen more as a way to connect with a group of people, which eventually became Soteria community. You think about Soteria, the treatment at this house, but it's at least half of the model is that part when they get discharged. Because if you think about like inpatient settings, the last thing they want to do is see an ex-patient back at the site. With Soteria, it is encouraged. You want people to come back and connect with new people, and that's essentially what happened. You created a community of people, much larger than the house itself. And when people got ready to discharge, they had people a lot. I think about, I calculated, so I think like about a third, somewhere between a quarter to a third people who left Soteria moved either in an apartment with an ex-resident or moved in the current building with extra. So, and they moved fairly close to the house itself. So what you have is this community that's, as it got larger and larger, to get more and more people. And not the community is not only ex-resident, it's ex-staff and ex-volunteers. It's a community of normalcy. And so you get, and so this gets really, in the research, it's not there, and so it rarely gets talked about. But it is a profound part of the Soteria model, that community concept. And like I said, when I tell people that, they say, "Well, yeah, right, sure, community." And I said, and Lauren and I think it was somebody else, at the end of the project, we wanted to test this project. How much community do we really have, Soteria? Now, this is 13 years later from the beginning. And so what I did was it was 2 staff and 3 ex-residents. I called them and talked to them about going out and finding the resident and let me know who they found. And we contacted over 80% of the community through the network, not me calling anybody, just through the network itself, to tell them that we were going to have a party at the end. That itself is a statement. Ask a hospital unit to go out and find who they are. You don't. They're not a community. It's a community, and that community is very important in terms of the model itself. Like I said, and also when you think about it, you think of the staff as being givers and the residents as being takers in terms of process. But that's not Soteria. A lot of lot of the residents came and volunteered and were involved in stuff. So the people who went through Soteria came back and saw themselves as givers, and not takers but givers in the process. So you get this really mixtures of who's who. I remember several times we had visitors come in Soteria and tell me, well, I can't tell who's staff and who's I had one person that got admitted and came in, and she was very upset the fact that we had her with all these patients, as she called them, and she started talking to this one person, said, assuming that the staff, talking to him and said, I shouldn't be here because those people. And the first person she pointed out, those people, was the staff. So it's like, because he was sitting over reading the paper. And so it's that kind of thing that makes you realize that you are creating a community. And once you get to know, that person got involved with people, suddenly her best friend was the person that was a consumer that she thought was the staff, was her best friend. So it's this kind of the dynamics of interaction. So that's important. The other thing I think you have to understand, it's hard to sort of grasp what I need to say to. I'm not sure how much the audience knows about Soteria or not know about Soteria. But I think one of the important things to understand about Soteria is there's this myth about Soteria is anti-everything, anti-professional, it's anti-professional, anti-family, and anti-science, anti-medication, which is none of it's true, because we had all the professions there. They were all part of Soteria, and it was designed by a psychiatrist. It's not like we were in anti-anything. And my philosophy about being anti-something, to be anti-something is to let that something have some kind of control over you, to be anti it. And my position is I want all the professions there. I want all of their learning and what they think to be there. What I don't want is their power over people. That's that's the problem. You can come in and tell me what you think about anything, but if I can laugh at you and say, I don't agree with you, which happened all the time, because in Soteria, the people talked about all kinds of things. It's perfectly fine. It's not to say something is to be anti something is not logical to me. So anti-profession didn't make any sense. And other important thing is family. Like I said, I was part of the first family organization that was formed. So in Soteria, there was no family organizations to impact on us in that kind of way. But the issue with family in Soteria is kind of complicated because you don't see it necessarily. And for instance, when I admit that for everybody that got admitted to Soteria, the next day or that day, I spent hours with the family to sort of get them to understand what Soteria was and for them to know, who we were and who they were. And my major theme, the most important thing I tell them is that we need 2 weeks with your kid to be a part of our program. And we need you for those 2 weeks to take care of yourself. Because usually almost all of the families at this point had just dealing with this person to be hospitalized. They were burnt out, essentially. And I assured them we would take care of the kids. All we need is 2 weeks separation, because we needed them to get a sense that Soterias were sort of their home, essentially. And that, you don't know how fast it happened. You could see it, hear it, and like when someone would suddenly first day when they get there, you ask them where's home, and they all would say home, where they came from. And then 2 weeks, most of the time they would say home was Soteria. That difference is profound. But once that 2 week period is out, there was no limiting to the family. The family can come up and visit anytime they want. And we couldn't stop them to come on that 2 weeks if we wanted either. But most of them did not, and allowed us to do what they did. And I think a lot of that because they did have time. Yeah, and several of the families went on vacation, which I thought was a very good thing, So that's a very powerful thing to get. And I think what you're doing, if you think about it, Soteria was the population that we were studying is very important. These were folks who had never been. They couldn't have the criteria. They couldn't have any more than 6 months in contact with the mental health system, and otherwise they didn't qualify for the study. So, and the age range was primarily people who were at the point where they were leaving home. They were becoming separate individuals from their family, not naturally. And so what Soteria saw itself as doing is reinforcing that process, allowing people to become independent, and then going back and then relating to the family as an independent person. Not that we were trying to separate the family from their family at all. In fact, the contact with most of the family were stronger after being at Soteria, not weaker. So in that sense, in fact, about a half of the appointments the clients have were taken to those appointments by their family. So again, we weren't anti-family at all. In fact, some of them, biggest volunteers early, were family members. One of my favorite family, a mother, there was for a long time, I actually covered Sunday by myself with volunteers. I had a woman who was a mother, one of the clients, who did all the cooking for me for every Sunday, and that was her. She said she didn't know anything about dealing with people, but she was probably the most powerful contact with the clients through food. And and she did all the shopping and like that, and then she just, loved it. It made my job so easy in terms of deal. Another thing I think I probably should say is part of the structure of Soteria. What was the staff's responsibility at the site? You think about what did the staff do? And this gets touchy sometimes because it was through the whole history of the time of Soteria, there was a lot of pressure. Not all the time. There was periods of time that I get this pressure. You needed to define the staff role, Voyce. You need to define the staff role at the house, and that's fine. I had no problem with that. So I would usually got in the meeting have several people the responsibility to set that up, to figure out what their responsibility. Because my position is I'd rather have it not unclear. My thing is that it was clear that it was the staff's responsibility to the house to function, but there was no duties assigned to the staff. Like they didn't have to sweep the house; they had to make sure the house was clean. That we had one meal a day that was done daily. Other than that, people could eat anytime they want because the people didn't get up at the same time, so there was no breakfast time. But usually people would get up and cook each other breakfast and stuff like that. And the same thing for lunch. But the evening meal was always prepared in a regular fashion. So it was the staff's responsibility that process happen in a way that's healthy and for the community, for the house itself. But other than that, there was no really definable duties other than the overall responsibility. And every time the group went off to set up find these rules, it became very clear it didn't make sense. And that would mean I would have to supervise them and tell them what to do. Okay, that to make, and the Soteria staff, I can only have good things about. Soteria staff was the most responsible group of people that I know. And I'm sure Jana's here that's listening to me. She's one of the perfect example.
You're getting brownie points. Getting brownie points.
Yeah, because I didn't need to tell people what to do. They instinctively knew what to do. You did get the sense that the two staff sort of function as a couple in most ways. But other than that, it functioned. It functioned like any normal family. When we did things, can people hear me? My screen.
I have to say,
Okay.
it was difficult to work in a place when any other job you'd ever have, you'd come in and your boss, which in this case is Voyce, you'd get told what you're supposed to do, what the job entails, and Voyce would refuse to answer that question. And I found that so interesting and challenging that you had to come to this job and he would just say, be yourself. Just be yourself. That's your job. Be with people. Hang out. Anyhow, I just have to say that it's so simple, and yet it's not that simple.
Yeah, it's not. It's very, very difficult. You think about it. But the point is, and the other part is like there's a concept that I call prescribe and ascribe authority. And what that means is when I'm at the house, am I the director of the program, or I'm Voyce, the person who's been there all the time and had the most knowledge? Those are different kind of roles, and how you interact with it, and when to use one and when to use others, very, very important. And some of the things I would do, for instance, there would be a crisis happening at the house, some crisis, and I would get called, and I would come to the house, and usually whatever the crisis was that's being handled, and my normal thing to do was to look at, and usually the house is in chaos there, that I would go wash the dishes. It's probably the most profound thing to do. And for me, it gave purpose, and it actually, you recognize the strengths of the people who are there. And if I'm actually needing it away, I'm there to do that. But usually just me being there, the ascribed portion of me is very powerful. Again, I'm not sure if people are hearing me or not, because I don't see anything on the screen, but
Yes, you're being heard.
okay, yeah, I see you now. It's hard to know when suddenly I'm talking to myself. But the thing that's, I could say, that's important. There's I go back to these anti things. When you think of it being against something that doesn't make any sense, but how people interact to me was the Soteria evolved through the first 3 weeks. By not defining anything, we had to sort of figure it out, and there was no big powerful things that people are telling us what to do. There's one other thing that, like I say, being with, and like I say, the visual is actually the concept of being with. And to understand the other part of doing to, I want to give an example of what doing to would be. And the best way to describe that, in that first, say the first month of the first client being admitted, our doctor, the psychiatrist, was uncomfortable with the fact that we had no strategy to work with people. He was sort of, what do you do? So he decided to have us learn an intervention technique, and I'm not sure how it's called. Folks are here, but it was the Melanie Klein model. She's a neo-Freudian analyst. It's funny when I go back and think about when you're working with someone who's going through a really psychotic episode, and when you interact with them, you talk about good mommy and bad mommies. You interpret the dialogue, or whatever they're doing, as good mommy. And you have to realize, 71, this is before family stuff. Most of the research going on mental health in psychology and psychiatry was mothers, and this was really back in a very different time. So this good mommy and bad mommy, and so he took each individual staff and had them spend like 2 hours with our new client, training us how to use this technique. And I was the last person he trained, and I'll describe that training, which is, as I think about it, it's strange. We went up into her room, which is upstairs, and her room has a bed and it's sort of a large couch in it. And there was a small little chair, a regular soft chair. He sat in and he started doing his paperwork, and he had trained us about how to use the good mommy, bad mommy technique. And so I went and sat on the couch. I had brought up the first client with me, and she's come and I sat on the very edge of the couch, but I want she sat in the middle of the couch, and she started talking, and I started interacting, good mommy, bad mommy, interpreting what she's saying, and it was profound. For the first 10, 15 minutes, I see her accepting what I was doing, and it made sense, and I was sort of surprised at myself at being so good at what I was doing. He's sitting over there, he's sort of looking at me, but doing his paperwork. It's sort of like, a thumbs up, like I'm doing good, whatever I'm doing. It was in about 20 minutes, it dawned on me, she was in the middle of the couch. In the 20 minutes, she was next to me. She was gradually moving next. And at this point, I'm a male, and she's a very attractive female. And the doctor's sitting over there, and I'm looking at him, and he's putting his thumb up, saying, "Good job." Oh, but I'm getting uncomfortable. But it goes on, and she's relaxed, and it's still, I see myself as doing very good, except being uncomfortable with her sitting right next to me like that. And it's one of those warm summer nights. Is very comfortable, and she hadn't slept in 2 days, which is the other part of this. And before I know it, I realize, and she's going to sleep and leaning on me, leaning on my shoulders. And I'm looking at the doctor again, and he's throwing his thumb up and fine, great. And within 10, 15 minutes, she's asleep. And I'm just sitting there. And I dawned on me that the doctor went to sleep. So he's asleep, she's asleep, and I'm sitting there uncomfortable. And this goes on for a half hour, just sitting there. I didn't know I had no idea what I'm doing, except that I think I'm doing a great job. And so he wakes up, she didn't wake, actually, he wakes up, and then and he said, "You do a great job." And I sort of sit up and laid her on the couch and put a sheet over, not a blanket over her. And she actually slept for over 8 hours. The first time she had actually went to sleep for an extended amount of time. And to me, in some ways that's great, but still, I'm not sure what my role in this process, other than making her feel comfortable or whatever, because the dialogue, what she's saying, was totally irrational. Didn't make any sense. What she was saying was the term word salad. It wasn't. She was saying something that was logical, and I was just interpreting what she was saying, which was probably just illogical as what she was saying. But as doctor and I walking down the stairs, and one of the female staff comes up and sits in a room with her, because somebody was with her pretty much all the time for the first month of her stay. She was always somewhere close. And he was telling me how great I was. I was a natural. I'm still not knowing what I did great, but I accepted it, and I could walk out, and I just said it was time for me to leave because I'd been there like 10 hours, feeling great, feeling like I was a natural, whatever what he was saying. The end part of this is important, because if you realize what I was saying, this is doing to, not being with, because 3 years later, she's visiting us at the house, and all that staff that she knew had left, and we're laughing and having a good time. And she goes with me to lunch, the cafe that we go right around the block that we always go to eat. And we're out laughing. In about 10 minutes in the discussion, she stopped and looked at me with this intensive look, and I'm looking at her. What are you looking at? What? And she said, "Do you remember that night?" And I knew exactly what she was talking about. And the embarrassment, the fact that she remembered, is that the assumption is that when somebody's going to, that they don't know what's going on, and which is totally wrong. She not only knew what was going on, she knew everything that was going on. And the thing that was most powerful, she looked at me and said, "Do you remember that night? You were really kind of weird, in a weird space. I mean, it was the most," she said, "it was the best night I've had. It was so comforting and good, but you were really weird." And say, "What is all this good mommy and bad mommy stuff you?" The realization that she was aware of how bizarre I was. And two, you don't realize that is, I thought I was doing great, and the doctor said I was doing great, but she was right. It was not me at all, because after that, I never did anything like that after that. But that was very powerful in terms of me to understand who, and that's another powerful thing about Soteria, because when people come back who've gone through that process, they tell you how they felt about you. Then you get immediate feedback, not feedback from your staff and other professionals. You get feedback from the source, and that is very powerful. It impacts your life. I Actually, I've talked a lot. I probably should just open it up for you. There's a lot I haven't said, but there's no way I'm going to be able to talk a lot too much about Soteria.
Say Voyce.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Voyce. I just want to make sure everybody knows that after we're done at our 4 o'clock, we'll still leave the space open so people can talk with each other even after the official program's done.
Well, that's it. I'm open for discussion.
Say Voice, this is Tom Jorgensen. I don't know if you remember me. I was one of the last residents there at
Of
Soteria
course I
House.
remember you. Of
And,
course I-
you know, I've been in a lot of programs, and it was the absolute best place I was ever at. I still keep in touch with Rob, reconnected with Kyle, was in touch with Louise until she passed, Philippe Lucier, you know, and then there was Judy and Linda. And it was the greatest place I was ever at. And it was, you know, social distance has a different meaning today, but back then it was more of an egalitarian setup, as you've described. And today, I'm on the behavioral health board actually right now in Santa Clara County, and
Oh, you
just
can,
wanted to thank you. It was an absolutely great program.
yeah, I'm glad you said it because you reinforced the thing that we never get talked about, the fact that people interact with each other. And when you left Soteria, it wasn't staff and resident, it was you were part of Soteria. And that's a very powerful thing itself.
And the ability to come back and do things and be there and have community. Yeah, I just wish there was more of that.
To be able to be a giver in the context is a very powerful thing in itself. To see you as someone giving something to somebody, very having the needing something, and that redefines you and it allows you to go out in the world and be a part of that as a whole person, and not be drugged up on medications and all, and not be the only thing you're experiencing. So thank you. It's good to see you. It's amazing. I didn't expect that to see people from Soteria. This is good.
Thank you. And we had a lot of great questions in the chat. Shall I start with some of the questions people asked during the chat?
Sure.
The first one was, were there non-medicated, I'm sorry, were there people who were medicated prior to coming into Soteria who stopped going on medication? And if so, did they have medication withdrawals and how was that handled?
Okay. Yeah, this is a good question. Remember the criteria with Soteria, no one could have been treated in mental health system more than a month. That means some people did have short medication for a short period of time at some point in their life. That doesn't mean they didn't, but rarely did the person come to Soteria at that point when they came to Soteria, they would be on medication, with some exceptions. We took a couple of residents that were from another hospital that became part of the study, and one of those residents was someone who had been treating less than 6 months, but over 5 months, and very aggressively treated in that period of time. And she was on, when she came to Soteria, she was on, this person could be no more than 110 pounds, 105 pounds at best. And she was on 3 different types of psychotropic drugs at the highest dose. And at the hospital said that, well, we couldn't take her unless we agreed that we wouldn't just take her off the medications. They gave some time period, and we sort of agreed with it. But she was so out of it. She was stable. Yeah, she wasn't acting out because not very very hard for her to get up and walk because the amount of medication she's on. So we took her, and it took us about 4 weeks, because our doctor said that this was unprofessional to have this amount of medication on this person at this level. So we immediately started taking her off the medication, and it took us about 3 to 4 weeks to get her off all of the medication. And you get the same process that getting off the medication, you get all of the symptoms that she had before she was hospitalized, and then that process went through just like any other person who went to the symptoms eventually go away without the medication, and she was one of our better outcomes. But I don't know if did I say something about the first person who actually, I think did I say something about the first person who actually got medication in Soteria? I'm not sure.
No, I
Remember
don't
if I
think you said that yet.
Okay, I think this is important. Like you say, at the beginning, we were sort of anti-medication. No one got medication. Where medications was introduced for the first time was we had this one person who admitted who just went in his room, and you could see he was having symptoms, but you could see him talk, but he didn't talk, and he was, you know, he didn't act out, and he'd come out and eat, and he would go back in his room, and that went on for like 3 weeks, and like the staff got upset at the fact that this person would interact with them. You you get it. Actually, this was in that weird period, the first few months, that you not being psychotic, doing the hearing voice was great. People didn't mind that at all. What they didn't mind is you not interacting with them. And so after 3 weeks, he just didn't change. So people got frustrated, and the doctor suggested that why don't we just give him a small amount of medications to see if that would do some change. I believe that actually there was some element of punishment that was coming from the staff. They were able to do something to make you come out and interact with us. It wasn't me, but I think some of the staff actually had that too. So we did give him a small amount of medication. Within 2 weeks, he started to come out of his room and started to interact more and more. And the thing that you think giving the medication would make him less symptomatic, it did totally the opposite. He came out of his room, became more social, but he became much more symptomatic. He started hearing voices and being more of himself, that what we thought the real person was. And eventually he just got through it and became, with the symptoms gradually went away like everybody else. And usually if the average person who came to Soteria within that first month or month and a half, usually they became symptom free within in that period. We have exceptions, but that's generally what happens. You think that medications, and if you look at the research, it shows a straight line between symptom reductions at the hospital who got 100% medication, and the Soteria group who got 8% in the time where they were at Soteria, 16% over the 5-year period. The symptoms at Soteria was exactly the same as symptom reduction at the hospital, regardless of medication or not. So that's a statement. I don't know why, but it's, I suspect if they would interview the clients a little more often, it probably would be, we might find some different. But that is, to me, a profound thing, that these medications obviously didn't reduce the symptoms of the patients in the hospital.
Great, thank you. We're getting a lot of great questions. We'll do our best to address all of them here. If we can't, we can share answers after the talk.
Okay.
The next question was there I know Voyce, you mentioned Ward 11. Someone asked, was there a study done on Ward 11?
Was a study? Yeah, that was a research project. It was a federally funded research. It was a study itself, and it was if you look back to the 70s, 60s, and 70s, there was a lot of research for medication that weren't controlled by pharma. So you can get these studies that were looking at medications from different perspectives, real research around medication.
Yeah,
That's not happening now.
Can I cut in? Sorry. It was my question. You specifically mentioned a study that was double-blind placebo medication versus non-medication in the context of Ward 11, and I was just.
That's Rappaport.
Was there a published study about? Because there's generally a lack of this kind of studies, so that's why I was.
I looked it up on the internet, I guess 10 years ago, and I found it. And it's called the Rappaport. Maurice Rappaport was the
okay. Okay. Then I read it. Thank you.
Maurice Rappaport and Julian Silverman was the psychologist that ran, those two ran the study. And that would have been in the late 60s. So, yeah.
Okay. I didn't know it was the Ward 11, but no, okay, thank you.
Yeah, it was called Ward 11 because the hospital it was named by, the units were called Ward. So, and it was Ward 11 where the study was done. It was a good study, but of course it came out with the wrong result for pharma, and so it got smashed. Like
that's why nobody knows about it.
Yeah, that's why nobody knows about you. I'm not sure if people are aware of Robert Bola. He's a psychologist he's not now there, but he was a psychologist at University of Southern California. He did a retrospective study. He go back and looked at all studies that were done through history about comparing medication use and non-medication use, and he found that 100% of the non-medication use studies had better outcome.
You mean John Bola? Yeah.
Yeah. That's, and I think it's important. And John Bola, he's not. Last time I saw him, he was in New York. He's not. I think they were recruiting him. Some university and on the East Coast was recruiting him, so he's probably not at University Southern California now.
How do you spell his last name?
Bola.
He's actually retired, Voice. He's in LA.
Who's in LA?
John
Jim?
Bola. He did get recruited and
we presented together in upstate New York, and he was there was several professors, trying to get him to recruit him to the East Coast there. So I don't know. I never talked to him since. I haven't talked to him since, so I don't know where.
Was that recently or years ago?
That was years ago. Probably that last time I saw. I don't think I saw you at that visit, but right after that, I think we were in Canada together or somewhere.
We were at Intar in New York.
Oh, Intar, New York, right? But it was just before that.
Okay, so yeah, anyway, he's around, folks, and I have his email if somebody needs to reach him. He's retired.
Yeah. Good. Any more questions?
We've got a lot of questions. Some people kind of answered this on the chat, but there might be more to answer. Someone asked, is there a Soteria House that is not affiliated with a mental health facility, but is embedded in the community and run by people with lived experience? And several people mentioned Pathways Vermont, the Soteria House that's under the umbrella of Pathways.
Yeah. I'm not the person that asks. I know of these places, but I'm not familiar. I have never been to any Soteria or read. I've talked to people from the Alaskan, but not anyone from the Vermont one.
Yeah, isn't the Vermont one contracted with the state with Vermont Mental Health? And I know it's not run by people with lived experience, but. And what about in Bern, Voice? When years ago, I know the places in Switzerland are still operating, but I imagine they're different than.
Yeah, that's. I can see what is his name. That's the Lou Ciampi. Yeah, Lou Ciampi is important too in mental health. He replicated the Soteria study in Bern, Switzerland, back right after Soteria. I think it started before Soteria ended. But he had the same he found the same thing. Sounds very same thing that the Soteria did. But the important thing about Lou Ciampi was he did a study. This was before Soteria, right, or before Soteria, where he went out and most of the studies on schizophrenia done, 2 years, maybe 5 years before, and rarely, I think there's one study of 10-year study, but all the very short, and the outcome looks terrible because you look like if you get diagnosed schizophrenia, you're gonna be schizophrenic the rest of your life. That's the theory back then. But Lou Ciampi did this large experiment where he went and looked at people 20 years post their first diagnosis, and what he found that this population looked pretty much like the normal population. They were almost none of them were on medication. They're most going out and living normal lives. So it distorted this position that if you've been diagnosed schizophrenic, for the rest of your life you're going to be schizophrenic. It shows that eventually people get off the medication and go back in more into the normal population. That study was replicated by Vermont. It's called a Vermont study.
Longitudinal study.
Pardon?
The Vermont longitudinal study.
That by Courtney Hardy. Yeah, she's a friend of mine. She replicated the study because people in Vermont never leave. And so she was able to find, because it's easy to find people over 20 years because most of the people are still there. And she found exactly the same thing that Lou Ciampi found in his study. This would be years later.
Voice, can you spell Ciampi and Courtney Hard's last name?
Courtney Hardy. That's I have it written down. Here, let me.
Hardey.
Harding. Harding.
Harding.
And
I'm putting this in the chat. And Lou Ciampi, Ciompi.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So someone also asked.
See, that's why I like that. She has all the answers.
I'm sorry. Someone also asked the spelling of Rappaport Zilberman.
Lieberman. Yeah, Rappaport Lieberman. Lieberman's psychologist, Rappaport is a psychiatrist. So it's usually listed under Rappaport, the study. Like I said, I found it on the internet a long time ago, but I haven't looked, so I'm not sure. The other important person in this field that you would probably be helpful, and it was really helpful to Soteria, I need to talk about, is David Rosen. He's a known figure. He's the person who did the famous study called "Being Insane in Insane Places." Being insane in insane places, I think the name of it. Yeah, he did a study where he took his grad students.
Oh, right.
And he had them go to private hospitals, state hospitals, county hospitals, and he told them to not be bizarre, but just to say that the night before I heard a boom in my head, and not define it. This make it weird that it was obviously something strange, and this to use that. And what he found that almost most of them got admitted into these hospitals. And once they were in the hospital, they were told to do not act bizarre, do anything weird, but take copious notes about staff faces on the unit. And then after 2 weeks, they were supposed to tell the psychiatrists or staff that they were part of a study, and that it wasn't that, and the expectation they would be discharged. But reality sits in that almost very few of them got discharged. They thought that the saying that they were studying it was part of their delusional material, and they were discharged. And so Dr. Rosen had to go around and get these folks out of these hospitals, and that was his studies, and it went viral, not viral, it was on New York Times published, and it became a huge deal. This was been in the early 70s. David and
What's his name? I'm sorry, Rosen?
David Rosenhan. He was
when you told that story about that, a resident who many years later said that you had acted strange. It reminded me of Rosenhan's study, because one of the experimenters was taking notes, and later they found out that in the record it said patient engages in strange note-taking behavior.
Well,
The doctors and the nurses never looked at what he was writing down. They just saw him writing and reached that conclusion. And the other, quote, patients said, "What are you doing here? You're not crazy. You don't belong here." But the doctors and nurses never realized it.
yeah. That's what I was going to say about the finding of the studies. The finding, they went back at all the doctors and patients and the staff, and the doctors all saw this person as being psychotic. The patients, by and large, all thought him as being normal, and they asked patients, "Well, what about his writing?" Well, they thought they may be journalists or something, normal things. Where David's research is called Attribution Studies. He did a lot of what he called Attribution Studies, and this is just one part of that. We attribute things because we expect things, and David is probably, if I think about the three most important people who are not staff at Soteria for me, would be Lauren first, David second, because at the end of the program, it was David who gave me the most support, and we spent most of the time together because he was at Soteria, joined with Nick Cummings, who was a psychologist in San Francisco, and who was the director of MRI, our umbrella organization. And we formed a separate corporation, and Soteria became a part, left MRI and became a part. And David and I were on the board. And so David and I, when we were thinking about continuing Soteria, because we knew the house was going to be sold and the study money was all running out, we went around to the different charities to get funding, and we got 2 charities that were going to buy a house for us, and he was also just a support. And David and I taught several classes at Stanford. So he and I, in fact, he and I and I'm trying to think of the other professor, Zimbardo, we taught a class, and David was a professor in the psych department and the law department. So he and I, like I say, he was support, and he was one of the key advisors for me in terms of when to close Soteria and making that decision and stuff like that. So I just want to make sure that mention his name and give him credit for that, because it was just advice. He didn't get paid for anything. It was important for him. The other thing that there was, and how David gets involved, when Soteria first opened, there was a question about Soteria being a legitimate model. And so what Lauren had to do was, what he called them Friends of Soteria. He went and assembled the top people in all of the professions to come to Soteria and talk to the staff to assure the profession that Soteria was a viable model. And David represents psychologists in that group. The other person who represented, I think, psychologist too, was a woman from Berkeley that I think was, I'll think of it later. But but it was this quality of people who came and visited Soteria just to legitimize the model. That was at the very beginning. So that's how David, the first contact. And from that point, we became friends, and we were friends pretty much. And that's why he had me. In fact, he'd set up, I had a slot. I was accepted at Stanford for grad school. And I decided to go to University of Wisconsin because I decided I didn't want to be a psychologist at the time. Nothing against psychology. It just, for me, it didn't make sense at that time.
Great.
We have about 10 minutes. Do you want to take a couple more questions?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, we have lots of good questions. So like I said, if we don't get to all of them, we can have Voice, I can email Voice and we can get you some answers afterwards.
So make sure you email us, and we'll put you on the rethinking list, and make sure everybody gets those answers, if that's okay with Voice.
you're
Yes.
usually causing me a lot of work here. Okay.
The next question is, how often were the 48-hour shifts that the staff did?
Once a week,
Okay, great.
48 hours. Yeah.
Great.
It was a weekly, that was weekly. You shift, set it off the week. You had the same day every week.
Mhm. Okay,
So,
great. And then were there house meetings?
yes, there were regular house meetings. Usually they were every week. A lot of times they didn't happen. Depends on what was going on in the house. But they were scheduled every week. I think that usually more happened more once, twice a week, and it depends on when. At that first, like I said, the first year it was a perpetual house meeting. It's pretty hard to describe when it was a house meeting, but they were meeting all the time because everybody was always there interacting. So, but if you realize, once I became director, we created a structure, and that was the Soteria structure. But up until that point, Soteria was radically different. And there's very different stages of Soteria. The stage Yana, if I recall, Yana was in, Yana, because that was pretty much in what I would call, she started at the end of what I call the curry phase of Soteria. There was this phase of Soteria of about 8 months where I think more than half the staff had been to India, or had one was a graduate student at the University of Santa Cruz whose major was Jungian and Eastern religion, and he was very to yeah. I don't know who I'm
Jay, you're talking Jay Lewis. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Another interesting staff. I really like Jay. Yeah, but yeah, and he is one of those different people who was great, that made Soteria what it was. So yeah.
Great. The next question was, can you speak more specifically to how Soteria helped the residents?
Well, okay, if you think, okay, here's the way to think of it. Now, this is me, because I can understand Soteria has no philosophy, which is obviously a philosophy. It's complicated. But individuals in Soteria all had philosophies. And so since I was so, in some ways, somewhat dominant, my philosophy probably has more meaning in terms of impact on the house. But my philosophy, what Soteria was doing, was actually what I see happening when people grow up in a family and stuff. A lot of times we go through, if you look at it, because as I went to the hospital and admit these people, one thing that's consistent: almost everybody I admitted had, before they had been hospitalized, had been up for days and stuff before they were hospitalized. There's something about being not sleeping and being psychotic. And the other thing is that they're at a stage where they're about to leave their family. A lot of them have got to college, and then the crisis hit. But it's still in that stage of separation from family of origin. And what Soteria really did, I think, going back, what I think, for me, what psychosis or that delusional stuff, we talk about delusional, is a way of change for you. And I want to make it clear, I do not see schizophrenia or what we said, I do not see it as a disease at all. I see it as a normal one normal way of people going through crisis to make change. And I think the change that is most dominant at this point is separation from family as an individual. And one way to do that is to become delusional. You change by definition. People have to see you different, and you come to sit there and you reconnect to another group of people outside of your family, gives you that point, and then whatever happens in that process of being a group, you normalize and you adjust to normalcy again. But it's a normal process. It's not a disease. It's not something. And part of me sees it as not really. It shouldn't really be in the realm of psychiatry itself. It should be in a very seen in a broader context. I think if you look at what we call primitive societies, this process has a role and has a position. I've done a lot of reading, and if you look at what they call the primitive societies, and you look at the people we call shamans, almost 80 to 90% of these people have gone through some kind of process, either through use of drugs or to process before they become shaman. It's in the literature. I think there's a reason for that, and it's as a purpose in that society. And those societies generally see people who are as being communicating with their ancestry. So there's a role for that, the broader. But in Western society, we see things that run into conflicts that's problematic for people functioning inside as some kind of disease. We tend to diseases. And this is not a form that we can go with. I have real strong problems with the DSM process and how we define diagnosis.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Like I said, there are a lot of good questions, and we can have Voice address those by email and disseminate those to the groups. Did I hear my name?
Rachel, I would like to suggest, because I heard Voice's response, and I kind of had the same one about responding to the questions. And I'm wondering if at some point, Voice, if it would be beneficial that we do a question and answer just with the core team on Zoom, and we just continue with the questions and you just speak them, rather than you being responsible or you agree to all that writing and typing and things, and then we could pick your brain more.
I'd rather speak to the thought. I mean, I am retired, and I have two daughters who are in their college, and the reason why you don't hear about me much is because I have sort of dedicated my existence since I retired to them, and they're both. I have two. Can you imagine how two and they're great kids. I mean, they're the pride of my life. These two kids, and this is their senior year now, and
congratulations.
Yeah, and they're twins, so.
Nice.
And so that I don't have a whole lot of time because and they're gonna right now they're living on campus in different ways, but and because of this virus, there's been this kind of distancing. They're kind of worried about me getting sick because I am pretty old. I hate to admit that, but yes. So they worry about me. So but we talk a lot on the phone and that So we can. I have a lot of time to talk and do it. By voice, without having to write and read. That gets more complicated.
So it sounds like Cindy's idea might be good. We'll record some of the questions and then make that recording available as a follow-up. How's that?
Okay.
And we'll let people know through the email. So if you want your answer, be sure and sign up for the Rethinking Psychiatry email list, because we'll let you know when we put it up.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot, I write a lot, and I read, every week or two I read a book. So I just read about science. I stopped reading about mental health a lot, but I realized that I'm finding that science does translate really good to mental health. If you don't realize it, it makes you think differently. And see, because I think that the notion of science in this area gets kind of skewed because it's financially connected to medicine. And I've seen different, like 90% of education in this field comes through pharma. And that is a bias, a very strong. So research is controlled, and more this research is done on these universities. The facilities that they now are owned by pharma, and so there's a built-in bias. And I think we need other people to be able to come and talk about this in a way that I'm not making sure I'm not anti-science. I am pro-science. That's what pretty much everything I read is science. I'm not, and Soteria is not anti-science at all. But I think in terms of consciousness, we know very little. You ask someone who's in the field, you ask them, what is consciousness? And they don't know. So how can you build a science on something you don't know what it is? And that's our problem. And we should be open and be willing to say, I don't know a little more.
I just want to add this because I think it's a very, very important point about what you said about that time of differentiation of our young people. I think it's very important that we acknowledge that's the second leading cause of death of young people between that age is suicide. I know.
The last 15 years of my reading has been looking at this issue. That is my assessment from my experience in my reading, that what is going on with this thing we call, and when you look at the DSM process, it does not define the illness. It doesn't define it at all. In fact, it is defined in the context of dopamine and the excess dopamine and all that kind, which has very little to do with reality, what's going on. But look, if you go look at primitive societies and things that we think of that, and look at the way they see it. If you look at, I don't know if the people are aware of the WHO studies,
World Health Organization, yeah,
where they found that the first world countries versus the third world countries, the more primitive countries, by far the first world countries have much worse outcome than the more primitive countries do with this. Yes. And diagnostic tactics that make sure they're measuring the same thing. The two studies showed exactly the same thing. The only real difference between the modern the countries, more called more primitive countries, that the modern countries use 61% medication, the primitive countries use 16% of medications.
Yes.
Only consistent difference.
Yes.
That's and they're usually not using science. They're talking about ancestors and all. I'm not suggesting that somehow these mystical things are real or not real, but obviously it is less damaging to people who are going through this process, or if you damage is the right word at all. But clearly what's going on with these with medications, they're damaging. And the other thing that we will talk about is the Harvard study. I can't remember. It was the Harvard study. They went back, looked at people being treated 100 years ago and now, and they could go back and look at the records. They could diagnose. We have gotten worse as time goes by. With medication and stuff, we've gotten worse, not better. They were doing back in oral treatment 100 years ago, when these Quakers used to take people, bring them to their house and treat, and have them live, at least they had better outcome then than they do now. These things should be answered or should be looked at and be thought about in ways. Why are we getting worse, and why? It doesn't make any sense. If these medications are doing things, what's it doing? And the other thing about these primitive countries, so much they don't have what we call chronic schizophrenia. I almost don't see these countries. What does that say? Because my point is what we call negative symptoms is really a product of treating people. The medications, that's what's causing the chronic schizophrenia more than the original reason for the the reason that they're being treated.
Amen. I think that whole piece about the inclusiveness in those cultures, that one doesn't become isolated and stigmatized, but are just part of being met as family where they are. I know we're at 4 o'clock now. I just want to say it's been a tremendous honor to be able to hear in depth to the level that we could hear for 45 minutes about Soteria. And I'm hoping that we can continue in some way that will make it easy for you to be there.
I'm available. That's not a problem. As long as I know in advance that I love this. This is great. I that has been a concern. I want to have an impact to be able to voice my opinion on these things. But it's like I said, it's been complicated, my life, and but this is I really enjoyed this 2 hours. It's been really, really enjoyable, and obviously you guys got a fine group.
Yes.
So,
thank you, everyone. And we miss our in-person meetings, but I'm so glad people were able to join from all over the world. And this concludes the official part of the meeting, but definitely people can stay and hang out for a while after. And like I said, we'll have Voyce answer the further questions. There were so many great questions. We didn't have time for all of them, but we will definitely have Voyce answer further questions and get that to you. So thank you, everyone.
And I want to say before we go, I want to remind people that hold on, I'm trying to get to, here we go, so people can see. I want to remind people that we're going to do a 5-week study group on this book. So you want to talk about race and about how it applies, not just to Rethinking Psychiatry, but the Mad Liberation Movement. So come and read and think deeply and talk deeply with us. It'll be on 5 Wednesdays in November and December. Information will go out in the newsletter that you'll get if you send us your email address. No pressure.
I wanted to clarify, Rachel, because when the room stays open, I don't know if Voyce intends to be a part of it, but it sounds like it'll be like we'll all be in the room and everybody will be trying to talk to someone else and somebody will be trying to talk to Voyce.